In this video I am going to look at a game I played a couple of Saturdays ago in a county match against Surrey. The match was played at the Sussex home venue in Hassocks. I was on board 7. I had the black pieces and was up against Susan Lalic, one of England's strongest female players. My opponent started with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3. This is the Scotch four knights, a solid opening favoured by those who just want a familiar position without much theory. Bishop b4, knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop d3, castles, castles. But now, instead of pushing the pawn to d5, black chose rook e8. The idea is to be able to drop the bishop back to e7 if white pins with bishop g5. Also, black may decide to play d6 rather than d5, keeping more tension in the position. Bishop g5, h6. It is useful to clarify the position of the bishop. White has to choose between maintaining the pin but committing to the queen side and abandoning the pin, releasing pressure on black. Bishop h4. White decides to maintain the pin. Bishop e7. Black breaks the pin as planned. Rook e1. d6. Black decides to maintain some tension, also as planned. White now has to decide what to do. Black's position is perfectly solid, so she decides on some improving moves. h3. It is useful to keep black pieces out of g4. Rook b8. Black brings his other rook into the game and creates some pressure down the b file. Rook b1. White prefers to defend the pawn without creating a weakness, as would happen after b3. Knight d7. Black offers the exchange of a pair of bishops. If white accepts, then black's position becomes less cramped, while if white declines by retreating to g3, black will put the bishop on f6, exerting pressure on white's queen side. Bishop takes e7. White decided that swapping the bishop was the better option, restricting black's active play. Queen takes e7. Queen d2. Knight c5. Black prepares to bring his bishop on c8 into the game with a solid position. b4. White decides to force matters, driving away the strong knight on c5 at the cost of weakening her pawn structure. Knight takes d3. There was no good retreat for the knight, so black just swaps it off. C takes d3. Now black should have just completed his development with bishop d7 when he has a solid position. Instead, he became worried about the advance of the white b-pawn and so chose the prophylactic a6. However, this is not necessary, and the pawn is actually less well placed on a6. Instead, putting the bishop on d7 would also have discouraged b5, while developing a piece and avoiding weakening black's structure. a3. White decides to defend the b-pawn to free the rook on b1. Queen h4. Black decides to put some pressure on white by threatening a kingside attack. Now, a reasonable idea for white would have been rook e3, activating the rook. White could now play rook g3. Also, the other rook could come to e1 and white could look to advance in the centre with d4. Instead, white chose rook on b to c1, hoping for pressure down the c file, but this was easily met. Bishop d7, developing and covering c6. White now advanced with d4, seizing the centre, although her pawns are a little vulnerable to attack. Black could now break with a5. If white plays b takes a5, then after rook a8, white cannot move the knight on c3 to cover the a5 pawn, as the pawn on e4 would then hang. Instead, black chose the aggressive rook e6. This, however, gave white the chance to break in the centre with d5. After c takes d5, knight takes d5 would force c6, and then knight f4 would force rook f6, when black's rook is on an awkward square. g3, queen g5, rook on c to d1 would leave white with a small advantage due to black's weak pawns and badly placed pieces. Instead, white chose the less incisive queen d3. Now black pursued his attack with rook g6. White brought a piece up into the defence with rook e3, and black took the chance to break with a5, eliminating his weak a-pawn. b takes a5 is met by queen g5, forking g2 and a5, and so regaining the pawn. Instead, white maintained her pawn on b4 with rook b1. Black now exchanged with a takes b4, a takes b4, and took the a file with rook a8. Now rook a2 is a threat, hitting f2. White decided to eliminate some pressure with rook g3. Now black could have just swapped with rook takes g3. And now queen takes g3, queen takes g3, f takes g3, rook a3 is obviously good for him, while f takes g3, queen g5 gives him sufficient counterplay. Instead, black decided to keep pieces on with rook f6, hoping to continue his attack. But this is rather risky, as his pieces could just all end up badly placed. Now, d5 can be met by queen f4 when the pressure on f2 is awkward. Rook f3 is met by queen e5. Queen d4 is also met by queen e5. And rook f1 allows c5 when b takes c5, d takes c5, frees the rook on f6 to come to the queen side. Black's activity outweighs his pawn weaknesses. Instead, white decided to play b5, looking to get control of the d5 square by removing the c6 pawn. This move disconcerted black, who had not considered the possibility seriously when making his previous move. However, he is still fine if he plays the correct response. Black now rejected c takes b5 because of knight d5, and after rook g6, he thought white had a fork with knight e7 check, overlooking that queen takes e7 was now possible as the rook had moved. Instead, white could try rook takes g6, f takes g6, knight takes c7, but she is only regaining the pawn, and after rook a5, knight takes b5, rook takes b5, rook takes b5, bishop takes b5, queen takes b5, queen takes e4, queen b8 check, king h7, queen takes d6, queen e1 check, king h2, queen takes f2. The endgame is drawn as white's king is too exposed. Instead, black opted for the inferior rook f4. Now, white could have played the very strong queen c4, when her pressure down the c-file gives her a decisive advantage. Black has no sensible response to the threat of b takes c6. C takes b5 is just met by queen takes c7, leaving black with terrible weaknesses on b5 and d6. Instead, white chose the less decisive b takes c6, bishop takes c6, d5, bishop d7, queen c4, although she still has strong pressure. Now black should have opted for passive defence with rook c8, but instead chose queen d8, hoping to keep the rook active on a8. This allowed Knight e2, rook f6, rook c3, when white's pressure would be very strong. Instead, white chose to put pressure on c7 with rook b7, but this neglected the back rank. Black should have played rook a1 check, which would have given him sufficient counterplay. For instance, rook b1, rook takes b1, knight takes b1, queen f6, queen takes c7, rook takes f2, queen takes d7, rook f1 check, king h2, queen d4, rook f3, rook takes f3, g takes f3, queen f2 check, king h1, queen f1 check, with a draw by perpetual check. Instead, black went passive with rook c8. After, knight e2, rook f6, white should have played queen c2, intending rook c3 when black cannot defend c7. Instead, she chose queen c3, but this stops white from playing rook c3. After rook g6, white should have avoided the exchange of rooks with rook e3 when she still has serious pressure. Instead, she swapped with rook takes g6, f takes g6, and white's advantage had largely evaporated. Play continued, knight d4, queen f6, and now white could have retained some pressure with f3. However, with both players now down to 5 minutes each plus the 10-second increment, she went for the forcing rook takes c7. However, this just led to a level endgame after rook takes c7. Now after queen takes c7, queen takes d4, white played the smart queen d8 check, forcing black's king into the corner, as otherwise the capture on d7 would come with check. However, this finesse did not change the evaluation of the position. After king h7, queen takes d7, queen takes e4, queen takes d6, queen e1, king h2, queen takes f2, queen e5, king g8, d6, queen f7, black had stopped the advance of the d-pawn. Following, queen d4, queen d7, g4, black now brought his king across to attack the white d-pawn with king f7. White was unable to do anything constructive about it. After king g3, king e6, queen e4 check, king takes d6, queen takes g6 check, white had only managed to swap pawns. Following, king c7, h4, black only had to evaluate that it was safe to exchange queens with queen d6 check to secure the draw. After, queen takes d6 check, king takes d6, king f4, king e6, g5, h takes g5 check, king takes g5, king f7, white offered a draw without making a move, which black accepted. This pawn endgame is a dead draw.